Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm just going to wait a moment to get everybody in the room, make sure we have everybody with us, and then we will get started. Okay, so I think we'll get started. Welcome to today's webinar, which focuses on patient-centered long-term follow-up for gene therapies. We are delighted to have you with us, and we look forward to an informative discussion. Before we get started, I just wanted to note that closed captioning is enabled, and if you would like to view the captions, please click the CC Show Captions box at the bottom of the screen. But please make sure to keep the captions in English because if you change it for yourself, unfortunately, you do change it for everybody. And so we just want to keep it on English. My name is Carolyn Chapman, and I am your moderator for today. I am a lead investigator at Brigham and Women's Hospital and a member of the faculty of Harvard Medical School. And I lead the Cell and Gene Therapies project at the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital in Harvard, which is hosting this webinar. Um, the Next slide, please. The MRCT Center is a research and policy center focused on addressing the conduct, oversight, ethics, and regulatory environment for clinical trials around the world. We engage diverse stakeholders to identify emerging issues in global clinical trials and to collaboratively create and implement ethical, actionable, and practical solutions. In September of last year, the MRCT Center's Cell and Gene Therapies project launched a working group to collaboratively identify and address challenges and issues arising in the context of long-term follow-up studies for gene therapies. And the group recognizes the importance of considering the needs of patients in the design and conduct of these studies, which led us to arrange this panel today. Next slide. Please note that the opinions expressed today are those of the presenters and are not intended to represent the position of Brigham and Women's Hospital or Harvard University. The center is supported by voluntary contributions from foundations, corporations, international organizations, academic institutions, and government entities, as well as by grants. And we are committed to autonomy in our work and to transparency in our relationships. The MRCT Center and its directors retain responsibility and final control of the content of our products, results, and deliverables. I have no personal conflicts of interest relevant to the discussion. Please also note that we are recording this meeting and plan to make the recording publicly available on our website. Next slide, please. Just to provide a bit more background on today's topic, gene therapies are a complex class of therapeutics that involve transcription or translation of transferred genetic material or the alteration of human genetic sequences. Many human gene therapies have the potential for long-lasting and transformative health benefits, but there are also long-term health risks. Therefore, the FDA and other health authorities recommend long-term safety monitoring of recipients of certain types of gene therapies, those with a risk of delayed adverse events. And as these studies can last years, 5, 15 years, even up to a lifetime, they pose significant scientific, operational, and logistical challenges. But they also pose burdens, particularly on the patients who participate in the studies. And so it's critical to consider patient needs and preferences in the design and conduct of long-term follow-up studies for gene therapies. Next slide, please. So we are really grateful for our three distinguished panelists who will discuss with us today their perspectives on patient-centered approaches for long-term follow-up studies in the context of gene therapies. We have with us George Eastwood, Executive Director of the Emily Whitehead Foundation, Tisha Samuels, a gene therapy recipient and co-founder of Journey to Excellence, and Dr. Jessica Scott, CEO of Legacy Health Strategies. And also we have with us Amina Burbeck, who's a program manager at the MRCT Center. I am first going to ask each of our panelists to tell us a little bit more about themselves and how their experiences and work relate to long-term follow-up, and then we'll get into our discussion. And just to note, we will have time at the end for audience Q&A, and we ask you to please use the Q&A box to ask your questions as the chat is not available. And so now I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and provide a little bit more about their background. And we'll start with Tisha.
Thank you, Carolyn. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tisha Samuels. I am, first and foremost, before I ever became a co-founder and president of Journey to Excellence, I was a daughter, a granddaughter, a wife, born with sickle cell disease, genotype SS, back in the 80s, prior to the issuance of having to do a PKU to find out that I had sickle cell at birth. However, at the age of 2, I was diagnosed and I became a sickle cell advocate at the age of 13, which is simultaneously when I had a TIA. And anyone that knows about a TIA, so I lost the entire left side. I had was became inoperable and really had to struggle to become more independent. And with that, I saw some of the challenges as a sickle cell warrior fighting against not being believed for your pain and things of that nature. So I really started my advocacy journey there. For those who are not aware about sickle cell is a genetic red blood cell disorder that affects the hemoglobin. That hemoglobin or lack thereof, that hemoglobin really causes the red cells to be misshapen and cause extreme pain, and so many other illnesses and infections and sometimes even death. The challenges of sickle cell vary by the journey. So some of the challenges that I face really from a warrior to a warrior, it can vary. But for me and my perspective, it included extended hospitalizations, sometimes up to a month, multiple infections, pneumonia, and the stigma. If you can imagine not being believed for your pain and having to feel like you needed to put a business suit on just to go into the ER to be believed and to be seen, but not just seen, but seen. And that is really one of the challenges that you face. As you may know, the African American community has a lot of sickle cell and sickle cell trait warriors. And so that perception of needing opioids that even adults couldn't pronounce, but I'm coming into the ER asking for them and able to tell you exactly what dosage is needed threw a lot of people off. So you can imagine what we had to go through in order to even be seen and taken seriously. After 35 years of, and I could go on about my story with sickle cell, but after 35 years, I decided something has to give. This is not a quality of life that I signed up for. There has to be something for me. And so I was able to enroll in a gene therapy transplant. I actually went through Lyfgenia, which is now FDA approved as Lyfgenia, back in 2018. In 2018, I went to the NIH, just full of desperation of how can I change my life and the trajectory that is on. I was getting blood transfusions every 3 to 4 weeks in order to just be able to cope with daily life. Was on a significant amount of opioid medication, had already gone through a TIA, had a septic necrosis, and multiple other things. And so I was just desperate. And I don't think that's a place you want to start, but that was my starting point for signing on to a gene therapy trial. From there, 5 years later, my husband and I saw the challenges not only post-transplant, during the transplant, pre-transplant, but we really saw a need to really advocate for, provide tools and resources for sickle cell warriors, those that are adults who are still having to depend on parents and or spouses or children even for their care. And so we at Journey to Excellence, our mission is really to be able to bridge the gap between advocacy and action. How do we get the resources, the tools that this community needs in order to be a pillar of light and hope for those in our community? We serve Maryland as well as North Carolina, and we've been doing so since April of 2023. So it's a pleasure to be welcomed here, and I look forward to sharing in this conversation.
Thank you so much, Tisha. George, would you like to go next?
Thanks, Carolyn, and thanks everyone else for joining us and fellow panelists. And thanks, Tisha, for sharing your story. Unfortunately, it is a very common one that we hear as we expand our mission at the foundation. So I'm George Eastwood, Executive Director of the Emily Whitehead Foundation. I came to the foundation through way of cell collections and cell manufacturing. Started that about 15 years ago. I think at the time we were told and believed that that was the hardest part of delivering these medicines was creating them. But in the past 15 years, I think that has changed. And that these amazing advancements just are not getting delivered. So my journey became the board chair of the foundation, volunteered as executive director for a little bit. It was supposed to be 6 months, and here we are 3 years later, after a very long stint with an interim in front of my title and working with our amazing board and growing our mission. Stepped in as executive director and full-time in January, and working to extend our mission, which was originally to fund pediatric cancer treatment. But as we move forward, and this will be public a bit more in September, building the support services for patients and caregivers that are needed for childhood disease and beyond. And more specifically, we've been getting really involved in advocating for all patients that can receive advanced therapies. While the disease journey is not identical or the same for anyone, there are commonalities in cell and gene and advanced therapies that need to be addressed, and one of them being long-term follow-up, making it more patient-friendly, patient-accessible, and trying to find those commonalities and advocating at a policy level and gaining as much patient input as we can to inform the world what we can do better in clinical delivery, how we can have these paid for, covered, and even supporting patients in that journey, whether it's travel and lodging, mental health support that does not fall under many guidelines, as Tisha points to. So many unique challenges for the disease states involved, but so many connected pieces that we can work on together. So expanding that mission, getting involved in patients' long-term follow-up in CAR-T is how we ended up here today, but we'll extend long beyond that and connect the dots for cell and gene. And thanks again for having me here.
Thank you so much, George. We really appreciate it. And Jessica.
Hi, I'm Jessica Scott, CEO of Legacy Health Strategies. My journey toward patient engagement in general really started when I was a teenager and my sister developed osteosarcoma, and she did not survive. And what that meant for me was not only an interest in seeing more medical products to address people living with cancers and rare conditions like her, but a need to get the patient perspective in the development of new medicines in the process of clinical development. So I went from being a frontlines physician for the first 10 years of my career in family practice, and that led to wanting a more policy level impact. And I attended law school, kind of combined those two careers into the pharmaceutical industry, where I increasingly focused on the drug development process and ensuring that patient perspectives are built in more and more as we move forward. And for long-term follow-up studies, patient engagement is not an option, it's essential. So I'm here to kind of help the community understand that we really need two things from the perspective of patients: to understand their experience so we can design long-term follow-up studies with the patient needs in mind, front and center, and also to understand how to keep study participants engaged for the long term. These insights need to come directly from patients and the patient community. And it's essential that we do get these insights, because otherwise we're not going to be able to develop cell and gene therapies or keep them on the market. Interesting fact that the FDA has said that 1 out of every 5 trials in 2023 were cell and gene therapy trials. And moving forward, beginning this year, FDA is predicting 10 to 20 gene therapy approvals annually. With current changes, I'm hoping that that's still a number that can be achieved because of the changes in quality of life that Tisha spoke about. I also mentioned this statistic because I feel that the pharmaceutical companies, and I've been in big pharma for over a decade, that we haven't really thought about what it takes to have participant engagement for 15 years. We've been focused on the recruitment side of the development process, but not so much on the long-term follow-up, but yet it's essential. If we don't have the long-term follow-up, then we won't be able to understand the durability of treatment benefits, the safety issues that may arise, and a timely intervention if safety issues do arise over that period. We won't have the insights that we need for any post-market labeling changes or guidance document development. And there's a risk that without quality data, complete data sets, that we won't have the market approval that was granted for the accelerated access pathways, but instead we'll have products withdrawn from the market because we don't have the data to support that. Patient engagement for long-term follow-up studies is not optional, it's essential. And we'll talk more about that as we go on over the course of this discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jessica. I think I lost you for a minute, but I'm not sure if that was on my side or on Jessica's internet connection, but it came right back, so I think we're all good.
Okay.
Um, I wanted to start, as you, Jessica, as you said, and George too, the patient's views and perspectives are so important in getting their input. And Tisha, you are the one who have the experience. And so I was hoping you would sort of start us off by sharing a little bit more about your own journey, and particularly the challenges that you faced, participating in the follow-up after you made that decision to back in 2018 to join the trial. And also the other question that I have for you is, what do you hear for, given your role with your nonprofit and interacting and advocating with the community, what do you hear from them about the challenges of long-term follow-up?
Certainly. So first, starting a little bit more about my journey. As I mentioned, my gene therapy journey began in 2018. And while it offered tremendous hope, the post-trial period came with its own set of challenges. But just getting to the gene therapy, there is a lot of mistrust between the patient as well as the community of physicians and treatment specialists, because for so long we have felt unheard. And so to be presented with these novel therapies that you are asking patients to participate in first is the first barrier to get over. And if I'm completely transparent, when I was desperate, but my family, it's like sickle cell is what we knew, to be able to sign up for a trial where at that point there was not there. I was patient. I was early on in the trial, and so there weren't many patients that could have and speak to the experience of what it would be like to go through this. And that was where faith met science for me. Believing that and trusting in a higher power that he was going to bring me through such a challenge. And he most certainly did that. But one of the things is that having that support system, there's a lot of patient support in most areas, in most cases, and I'll get to some of the things that I'm hearing from the community. But in most instances, and especially in mine with NIH, they were very, very supportive of myself as well as my caregivers. But of course, having someone to ensure that prior to, during, and after that support from a mental aspect, making sure that there's mental and cognitive wellness, checking on things of that nature, because there were some changes, some cognitive changes that I started to see little by little in my post gene therapy transplant. One of the most significant things that I needed to do was adjust to the ambiguity of the long-term healthcare outcomes. You know, a lot of times when you're asking patients to sign up for this, you all need the data. However, we're still the patient when we don't want to feel like we're the data. You know, we're just the patient assigned to the data. So making sure that people feel heard, seen, listened to, not just heard, but actually listened to and actually integrated into the process of what the long-term follow-up looks like for them is imperative. Um, and it could sometimes feel heavily clinical and often disconnected from the emotional, social, and day-to-day activities of a warrior. And so that is why, you know, it's imperative for there to be access to them in a way that makes sense and fits into their life, not feeling like it's an extension of what they've already been through. Not necessarily from my perspective, but from what I'm hearing, scheduling and attending those follow-up visits often clash with real life. Remember, I mean, there may not be children, but they have parents. And so there's work obligations and transportation issues and moments where they just feel like they need rest. You know, this week may not work for me, but I know you need your data set to get your 2-year follow-up data. And also for me, the psychological weight. You know, there is this thought of who am I? You know, for so long, I was just so intertwined with sickle cell disease that post gene therapy, it's a brand new Tisha. You know, the energy that I've never had before and feeling completely normal and not having the pain every single day. So there's this whole identity issue that is happening. And I think that also needs to be supported. And that's something that I hear from the community. And last but not least, just from a broader sickle cell community, I often hear that long-term follow-up feels like an extension, again, of the clinical obligations rather than a partnership. And so, you know, we want to just be more than the lab results. So those are just some of the things and the feedback that we get in our community.
Thank you so much, Tisha. That's really powerful messages. And, I think it's in my time as a scientist, with my background as a scientist, um, you know, I think that there's been a transition, as Jessica was saying, to not view, research as, the research population and the scientists, but to sort of start to, have that engagement, have that involvement from the earliest stages. And I don't know if I'm going to just say, I don't know if we're there yet. I don't think we're there where we want to be, but I think that as Jessica is going to also, I think we're here because we're on that journey to getting to improving, that engagement and that involvement with the patient community, to make it more of a partnership. I'm going to turn next to George because the Emily Whitehead Foundation, I've learned through other ways that they've recently done a survey to learn more about patient experiences with long-term follow-up. And so, George, we'd love if you would share more about, the survey, how you got involved, and tell us a little bit more about the findings.
Yeah, and thanks, Carolyn. To both you and Tisha's point, we really have to interact with the communities that we're connected to understand what's going on. A lot of the clinical endpoints and other pieces that we talk about, patients can just become that data point when we're looking at getting a drug approved. But the clinical process, the engagement side, the prospects for long-term follow-up in these breakthrough therapies, starting with Emily being treated in 2012, quickly moving to approval in 2017, and regulations being built on the fly for probably the best reason, that the medicines and therapies were working so well that we had to get them to patients. But along the way, we have a lot to learn about what that engagement looks like. So as many know, for cell therapies like CAR T, a 15-year mandatory follow-up is standard. For some gene therapies and others within, it could be 5 years. But as we approached 13 years post Emily's treatment, we started to think about, how does the general community look at long-term follow-up? What are the pros, the cons, the burdens that we hear? But how can we look at it in a very general way, splitting across clinical and commercial treated patients, patients or caregivers, as you pointed to correctly, Tisha. It's not just the patient, and a very passionate board member of the Emily Whitehead Foundation, Sharon King, rare disease advocate, points to it all the time. When you have a diagnosis in a rare disease or a cancer, it's not just the patient, it's the whole family that receives the diagnosis. So within the work that we put together through our partner at Catalyst Healthcare, thanks to Nancy and Betsy for helping us interpret these results, build upon the results. But we kicked off, I think, last August with a goal of quickly acquiring 100 patients or caregivers to reply to our survey, focused around those barriers in long-term follow-up. Completed that, I believe, the very beginning of September, just in time to be part of a FDA listening session alongside some other patients on September 20th. But really the genesis of that is, we heard from, whether it's industry partners, patients, it can be cumbersome. There's things that can be fixed, but how can we bring some of the data to the community that is on the industrial side and the clinical side to see what we can do together? So we ended up having 96 patients in total, split pretty fairly between patients and caregivers, clinical and commercially approved, a range of timeframes, really trying to get an example for the general community of those that have received CAR T. And what we focused on were, how are you engaging with long-term follow-up? How many patients have made it to all of these visits? We saw that 23 patients had missed visits, if not multiple visits. We saw that a large percentage had stopped attending after 5 years. And we just saw a lot of distance barriers from the treatment center. As we know, in the CAR T community and in any advanced therapy, there is limited sites at the very beginning as we roll out, and commercial approval doesn't necessarily mean access. It means it's approved, but we still have a lot of clinical operations to put together. So there's the distance from the center, and that being a barrier has only grown. Yeah, I think early, with the first 21 patients that we know well in Emily's trial, some of them really love flying back and seeing the amazing team of Dr. June Grupp and Levine, because of that care you can get early in a trial that just cannot exist as we scale these therapies to more people. So really interesting findings across that point. I think most interesting, we wanted to find out, what are those barriers? We mentioned the distance to site. We mentioned the travel costs. We mentioned the time off of work and the personal commitments that are often lost in this. And as we move towards commercial approval, both for sickle cell gene therapies and for CAR T, there's a lot of regulation around who can pay for that, if it can work. And then there's just the personal aspect of not wanting to drive into the city. I joke about this often, in that I bring my children to New York City when they're 1 year old and make them order a pretzel in Times Square to get used to the chaos. That's not always the case. And really interesting in my journey here at the foundation is talking to patients that are, less than 2 hours away from Philadelphia, that don't want to drive into the city, don't want to add any more stress. They don't want to park in the crazy academic campuses that we've all probably driven to and might have today here on the call. And that really struck me when we had these conversations, as I had them in a one-off way. And then there's also those that did go to these centers. They don't necessarily want to deal with the trauma of that now that they're feeling better and or even cured after 10 years. And however we go about talking about the sickle cell gene therapies, I know there's a very difficult way to look at these as cures, and our healthcare system has never been built for the curative side of things. So it's just been an incredible journey learning that and really trying to understand how we can communicate better. I think some of the more interesting parts that we've looked at from a data perspective is asking what we can do better directly to patients, asking what patients would be comfortable with. So some of the data points that stood out to us were asking how comfortable are you sharing your electronic health records directly with the manufacturer of your drug? Now, in framing that question, we knew people, patients, caregivers that have been given a second lease on life often very much realize that these industry companies bringing these to market are their only hope. So contrary to public opinion of large pharma at times, I knew our patients would be generally favorable towards sharing that, but I think our number was 81% were either somewhat or extremely comfortable with sharing their data directly to the company that developed their drug. I think a very unique piece of the gene, cell, advanced therapy, and rare disease community is that connection to those that are making the treatments. So that was a really interesting part to find. We tried to dig further to understand even the use of AI. And this was, 6 or 7 months ago, so the world's comfort with AI could have grown. But I think 48% of patients were either somewhat comfortable or extremely comfortable with use of a data partner or a third party working within AI. So that was an interesting data point to be able to catch so early in the how can we do this better? How can we treat patients in a more reasonable way when we supply this? So presented that data in September, progressed to building a working group that we can talk about a bit later, and probably opened up a million more questions that we'd love to follow up on with other partners and dig deeper into these individual communities and even further disease states, because this is all encompassing and more approvals are happening. I think you pointed to 15 or 20 more approvals coming. What diseases are they? What are the commonalities within long-term follow-up we can look at? And how can we understand the micro communities that exist even within some of these?
Yeah, thank you so much, George. And some of those survey findings and survey questions point to potential solutions like use of EHR records and use of AI in interpreting the data that is collected and hopefully combined. But I also want to just point out that Amina has put in a link to the white paper that describes the survey results that George just provided an overview for. And so if you're interested, you can find it there. I'm going to turn now to Jessica and ask her to please share more about her work with industry clients and also to focus on what challenges they're facing in terms of this engagement and retention for this long period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. The work by the Whitehead Foundation has provided both qualitative and quantitative insights from patients, participants who have received gene therapies, cell and gene therapies. Tasha, you've also shared a lot of things that are critically important to you, to the community. Of course, there's going to be disease-specific insights. Not all cell or gene therapy applications are going to have the same issues across different patient populations. So what's important, I think, is to really think about the long-term follow-up at the beginning of the original clinical trial, because the connection from that point in time to setting expectations for the subsequent long-term follow-up study is important. Patients don't like to have surprises, and they like to be able to have certainty. And as Tasha said, the ambiguity is really tough. But to know that there's an expectation that participants in the original trial will need to participate in these long-term trials for 5, 10, or 15 years, or even lifelong, is really helpful. That means that sponsors really need to think about the design of these studies early on, and they're not necessarily doing that. it's a whole different space. It's a different mentality. And I think that increasing awareness that best practices or emerging good practices anyway are to let people know at the time of the original study that this is going to be something that you're committing to. Of course, people can change their minds and people can drop out. That's true with any trial. In fact, we know that out of the group of individuals who withdraw from clinical trials, that 64% drop out because of their choosing. Not that they have to, but because somehow the burden of participation has gotten to be greater than the value to that individual person. And with some of the things that both George and Tisha have mentioned, there's that post-traumatic stress from the medical condition and where it was treated that is real. I can relate to that as well from my own experience as a family member of someone who had osteosarcoma. My sister was treated. It's funny you mentioned New York City. In New York City initially at a major hospital, and then ultimately her last couple of years in Philadelphia. And I couldn't go to Philadelphia for a couple of decades afterwards because it carried so much negative feeling that I just wanted to avoid it. I couldn't, and same was the situation for my mother. It's the association. So if I were the patient, I can only begin to imagine some of the feelings that are brought up and re-triggered by having to go back into a site. The flexibility, I think, is important. And we're now advancing. We're talking about predictive modeling with AI. George, when you said that people are starting to miss appointments, if we had a mechanism for tracking what's happening with participants based on feedback from them, but also metrics of continuing in these long-term follow-up studies and how their lives change over the course of 10 or 15 years, then we can do a better job of meeting those needs and trying to minimize or eliminate barriers, greater flexibility, maybe there's remote visits. There are many things that can be done, and particularly through a digital communication platform. And what that does is allows us to provide sponsors and participants a more direct bi-directional communication during that long-term follow-up that would allow the sponsor to send information to participants in the trial, updates, thank you, gratitude, and also get information back through close-ended survey questions from participants about their needs and the challenges that they're facing. And maybe they don't know about the travel support and logistics support that's available. They haven't thought to ask, or they don't know they could ask for it. But if there was a communication panel platform that could facilitate this bi-directional communication in a compliant way, that would enable a greater sense of connection and commitment to the trial, that partnership that we've heard already mentioned here. It's about aligning expectations. It's about the results of a study that's been made public to the scientific community, also being made to the participant community. And you can do that with a digital platform that allows for the return or sharing of individual results, but also aggregate. And these are some of the ways that we continue to provide value and have participants feel like the partners they really are in these studies, particularly for long-term studies where getting results and learning more about the updates and regulatory status is something that participants could look forward to getting and receiving and being a part of during that trial. So those are some things.
Yeah, that's really helpful to hear about the challenges that are, that are encountered in the context of, doing long-term follow-up over these extended periods of time, and then this potential portal as a potential solution to, facilitate communication both directions and keep people, engage with the project and the study and provide what I also heard back is that, providing results to them or feedback to them, information to the patients, and not just asking, them
Exactly.
for their information.
Yeah.
George, I wanted to just see if you wanted to just, tell us, you mentioned, briefly, what the next steps are, post the survey. Um, the foundation, I know, continues to work on this, as you said, and looking forward, what ways does the foundation and its partners think that long-term follow-up should or could be improved?
Yeah. And, to piggyback on some of what Jessica was speaking about, uh, part of our survey originally was also how and when were you told about the long-term follow-up requirements? Were you told about that you could monitor remotely, that these were options? And by no means is it an indictment on the provider, because at the time of treatment, there are so many things going on. We need more robust ways to continue that communication. We like to say we want to meet patients where they are, and everybody is in a different place at the time of either collection or administration of a CAR T. So I think somewhere around 56% of patients were unaware that it was going to be 15-year follow-up. And I think 38 or to 40% of patients did not know you could go for follow-up in remote monitoring situations. And it's just the nature of newer treatments. You're not asking the right questions. You're not in the right place. So how can we continue that communication? And I spoke to some of the data earlier, the comfort around digital solutions. So leveraging new tools, digital portals, EHR, mobile apps, telehealth. It's not for everyone. There are people still on paper that are not online at all, but we need to make these accessible. And we know that the FDA is open to new ideas, the best initiatives, and other data capture that's happened. So what we took from the survey and in partnership with Catalyst Healthcare was convening a group of stakeholders, uh, both industry, academic, you name it, meeting probably at least twice a month for the last 6 months and working on creating a white paper that is just about ready to be shared, where sharing some of these insights and recommendations. So openness to digital portals, uh, increased telehealth and remote monitoring options, which we know conflict and can overlap with a lot of other policies from an insurance and a payer side, if anybody has that issue post-COVID. They're all prevalent, even in CAR T, which compared to some rare disease treatments, which can have as small as 5 advanced treatment centers post-approval. We need to continue those options. And specifically for CAR T, we're looking at the safety signals and seeing that from a timing perspective, that 15 years, for at least from a secondary malignancy side and others, uh, nearly zero happen after 5 years. So within that work that we're doing, promoting that flexibility and really pushing guidance towards regulators that we can open up to new forms of registries and also reduce time down to 5 years based upon the clinical data that we see for CAR T, and then explore deeper how we can look at other gene therapies to make it more patient friendly and more fitting to the data that we're looking at.
Okay, that's great. That's all great to hear. And it sounds like we'll be looking out for the white paper, the follow-up, no pun intended, the follow-up white paper,
Mhm.
to the one on the survey. I'm gonna go next to Tisha because I want to make sure we get her perspectives and on all that's been said so far, and any reactions to these ideas and anything, your perspectives on how we can truly create patient-centered long-term follow-up, which is what we're the whole point of today's.
Yeah, absolutely. As I was listening to Jessica and George provide, what is new and happening in that space, and to know that there are forward thinkers and strategists thinking about the patient moving forward. I had taken some notes, and I think one of the things that I think would be help is standardization. A lot of times you can't talk, I mean, you are I won't say you're discouraged, but you're not actually encouraged to talk to other patients who have gone through similar therapies. And that can be a challenge on both ends, but I think you cannot stop that from happening. For instance, warriors will talk to other warriors, other patients will talk to other patients and caregivers. And I think standardizing or having some type of standardization as to how the long-term follow-up paperwork process is actually rolled out to the patient and the caregiver in a way that's understood. I think all of us know here that everyone learns differently. And I think having those different modalities available so that people can actually choose how they best retain information, learn that information. Have it really highlighted at each follow-up visit how important that perspective of the patient is, why it means so much for them to have that aggregate data. I think sometimes it gets lost, that you've gone through this therapy, but I don't think everyone is appreciative of how it helps the doctors and the scientists to actually progress the therapy. Also leveraging the digital era that we've been in. I think really leaning into that. And I know there are some legal things around it. However, I think if we think about text messages to just check in, hey, how are you doing? Not a long survey per se, but just kind of giving two or three, questions, open-ended questions to allow them to provide that feedback to you in a way that's really quick and it fits into their daily lives. That bidirectional communication, as we talked about, really feeling like, instead of just waiting until that 6 month mark, 1 year mark, who is following up with the patients? Sometimes it's just nice to hear a phone call from the center to say, hey, this is, Beth. I'm here for you. Is there any challenges that we can help you out with? I think that goes a long way. It's just, having that one-on-one, that personalized touch it really will go a long way. Um, so I think that those things are some of the things that we can really tap into as we move forward and really gain the patients to become less apprehensive to follow up because when you're talking about 5, 10, 15 years, that's a long time and people begin to feel better. And of course, the longer they are away from the disease that helped them to get to this point, the less likely they are to really participate long term. And the last thing I would say is that I always say, hug a tree, don't send it to me. A lot of times when you go for the long-term studies, there are a paperwork, like they're throwing a book at you to actually fill out this document. And if we can find a way to digitize that, put a link somewhere, put a QR code somewhere, let me fill that out on my own time. I don't want to feel pressured or feel like the doctor's waiting there trying to see what my answers are, but give it to me in a space where I can actually think about my answers. But again, not having, 6, 7 page document that you need me to fill out at each visit.
Thank you so much,
I'll
Tisha. That's
just chime in quickly for Tisha. Just, I think during our prep call, you had mentioned, that discouragement of patients communicating with one another.
Yes,
And from a clinical perspective, we can certainly understand we want as pure a data as possible, but from the foundation's perspective, and probably all, it's facilitating those great patient-to-patient interactions that lead to the camaraderie that we see has some of those original trialists in the CAR T trial scheduling their follow-up together, really following through on the long-term data. So I think at times we can compromise the adherence and the patient connection that's needed. So we've been trying to look at digital tools to provide to patient communities across all of advanced therapies. How can they stay in touch with one another, even if it's just for a ride or for a check-in? Not necessarily about clinical data points or endpoints, but how do we keep allowing patients to connect to each other when we know sometimes it's actually directed against from a clinical data perspective. So thanks for
absolutely.
that.
Absolutely. The camaraderie and the community that it builds, it really is needed. And again, I think that when you are learning from the different perspectives, it's not to skew the data, but really just to be able to get those profound insights that only someone that has experienced it can understand.
Yeah, and Tisha, what your comments are also bringing for me is that, the importance of human connection, not just between the patients and the communities, but also the human connection between the team, the team that's doing the long-term follow-up, whether that's a healthcare provider or an investigator associated with the study you're involved with, and that maybe can't be replaced, especially given what you said earlier about some of the struggles, even if you're feeling better, that can also have its own emotional, components that are involved with that as well. So these patients need to get supported in the period after receiving gene therapies. So those are all really important points. I wanted to go to the first question in the Q&A from the audience, and I'm going to give this one to Jessica. It's a graduate student from Northeastern University asking about what innovative tools or strategies have you seen used to keep patients engaged, over a long period of time of follow-up, especially ones that go beyond traditional contact and actually empower the patient throughout the journey.
It's such a great question. And I'm really pleased coming from Northeastern. You may know my son, who's also a Northeastern student. So great
My
question.
daughter too. My daughter's a Northeastern student.
Oh, wow. That's great. So going back to something that Tasha said, and actually, George, you kind of went back to this as well. How do we address the needs of participants in a way that still complies with legal and compliance requirements for sponsors to not know patients in the trial, but have that for sponsors to be providing kind of that more personalized support for patients in a clinical trial. And through deeply understanding the needs of patients, we can enhance their experience and decrease the burden of participation. For example, now in the psychosocial space, there is a term called low interventional psychosocial support, which is a self-guided kind of therapy that could be implemented on a digital platform that would address the needs of the community, the participants in the trial, regarding how does it feel to not have sickle cell symptoms, to not be going to the emergency room like your peers, and to feel like, am I still the same person, which you expressed. And only someone who's been in that position could have such a deep understanding of what you're experiencing and to share some of the coping mechanisms and some of the ways that that person might have thought about it and found helpful. That's those types of interventions. I mean, for dealing with anxiety, a meditation or breathing exercise that's self-guided on a digital platform to help cope with some of the issues that may come up, revisiting the hospital where you were treated in the past and felt like you were seen as a drug seeker, for example. How do you cope with that? How do you deal with that? And those are things that can be built onto a digital platform. The informed consent can be broken down into bite-sized pieces with information living in a resource library of that digital platform that you can go back to and remind yourself, now, why was this procedure needed? Why do I need to go back to the site to get another test or procedure? What is the value of my continued participation for my community? And that kind of communication that really speaks to, in a very personalized way, what people need to stay committed and engaged. And I think that's critically important. I don't know if you've experienced, like I have, using a publicly available AI tool to ask questions about, what you're going to make for dinner that night or what have you. But the personalized responses, I'm so glad you like that recipe. Like you feel like you're working with somebody one-on-one and talking with them. And that's not a real person, obviously, but there are ways to make people feel heard, understood, valued. And that's what patients want to feel. And so we can come up with innovative ways to do that on platform. The mere use of a patient experience platform during a trial or long-term follow-up study is still innovative and novel for our industry, which adopts slowly to new ideas. But they're really valuable. And if we can improve the experience and the communication, if we can help people feel that they are the important stakeholder in new drug development, that they are, I think we're going to go a long way to having a partnership and getting the data we need to bring more innovative cell and gene therapies to market.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessica. And just this question from Megan. So there are, organizations that are developing these digital, right, platforms. I don't know if you want to just touch on that. There are, I think, various organizations that are exploring, as Jessica had just said, um,
Yeah.
ways of doing this. Jessica herself is an expert in this. And there's other companies, large and small, I believe, that are also exploring different mechanisms for this.
Yeah, absolutely. The platform itself is not so innovative and new. It's the use of platforms to build these very patient-centric aspects into a trial, either to reduce burden or to enhance the experience.
Okay, so we're coming up on time, which this hour just seemed to fly by. There is a question from Lynn, and who says, as the Associate Chair of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, DSMB, we are trying to decide who should have ownership of long-term follow-up data. Is there a role for the DSMB? Companies often fold or merge, and if they are managing long-term follow-up, who will take responsibility for long-term follow-up when there is a sponsor turnover? So I'm just going to address this quickly. I think that, this is certainly an important question. My understanding is that, patients, you know, believe, so, there is a movement that patients own their own data. At the same time, I think that the companies who are collecting and doing the studies, you know, typically would say that they own the data. So that's a complicated question, right? So I don't think we're going to have time to answer that completely. In terms of the responsibilities, if company or perhaps even a small academic investigator can no longer fulfill their responsibilities, obviously that's an issue, right? And one we don't really want to have happen. We want the planning to happen before. But I do know that the guidance for industry says that, in that type of a situation in the US, people should reach out to the FDA. And I did, and actually in a webinar we co-hosted with PGTME from NYU, we asked a representative from the FDA, and they said in those types of situations, they would try to figure out ways to have for the investigators involved with the long-term follow-up to continue the study. So I know I didn't fully answer that question, but hopefully that starts. And please, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I can direct you to one of the panelists. But we are coming up on 2 o'clock, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time, and I want to make sure that we extend, our thanks to this panel, to George, Tisha, and Jessica for sharing their perspectives, and just give them a chance to for any last words, burning last thoughts before we close out. Okay. If I hear none, I also want to thank Amina and Kristen Bartlett from the MRCT Center who helped support this, putting this webinar on. And I want to thank everybody in the audience for coming and listening and contributing in that way to today's discussion and for the questions as well. And on behalf of the MRCT Center, I'd like to invite you to sign up for our newsletter so that you can hear about our future events. Amina is going to put that link in the chat, and you can always find out more information about our work on the MRCT Center's website, mrctcenter.org. Again, the recording from today's webinar will also be available there. And the webinar from our previous long-term follow-up webinar, long-term innovative approaches to long-term follow-up, you can find that there as well. And so thank you everyone again, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you, Carolyn, and fellow panelists.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.